Paladins are one of the most interesting and powerful classes of the game, being both a partial spellcaster and a dynamic frontline combatant. Today, we'll be going over the 9 Paladin subclasses, also known as oaths, and ranking them on the power, versatility, and their added spells, channel divinity options, and the class features gained at 7th, 15th, and 20th level. Now let's get started. At the bottom of the ranking, at 9th place, we have the Oath of Devotion. The Oath of Devotion is one of the original Paladin subclasses and often considered the default Paladin. Its biggest issue is that a lot of the abilities don't add a whole lot to the Paladin's playstyle, more just reinforcing it in certain ways. The spells it adds that the Paladins don't already have access to are a few cleric spells like Beacon of Hope, Sanctuary, and Dispel Magic, which have their uses but aren't major game-changing options. Dispel Magic is good, but it's a go-to option for any other full spellcaster in the party most of the time, causing a lot of overlap. Like all oaths, it comes with 2 channel divinity spells. The first is called Sacred Weapon. This lets the Paladin use an action to add the charisma modifier to their attack roll while making their weapon count as magical for 1 minute. The downside of taking a full action means it's often difficult justifying not just attacking twice over 2 turns instead. That said, it comes up when you can't attack for a round for some reason, and it does combine well with things like Great Weapon Master's damage for accuracy trade-offs. It can stand out at low levels before you gain magical weapons too, letting you hit damage-resistant enemies. Not useless, but fairly situational. The other ability is Turn the Unholy, which basically works like a cleric's Turn Undead, while also working on fiends, frightening any fiends and undead within 30 feet and causing them to run and cower. Not bad, but it's often a worse version of a situational class feature that clerics already have, and can't automatically destroy low-level undead. In an undead or fiend-heavy campaign, this can be an effective ability, but Paladins with the Divine Smite are already juggernauts in undead and fiend-heavy campaigns. This could come up against a horde of specific enemies when the Paladin runs out of smites, but that doesn't curb how situational it is, especially when Paladins often have much lower spell saving throws due to charisma usually being secondary to strength and sometimes constitution. Next is a much more plainly good ability at 7th level called Aura of Devotion. This aura prevents charm effects from working on the Paladin and all allies within 10 feet of them so long as the Paladin is conscious. The aura increases to 30 feet at level 18. Charm effects are some of the most dangerous abilities in the game, capable of massively swinging action economy in fights. So immunity to that can remove an entire dimension of threat to an adventuring party. It's even relevant in social situations, as charm spells are the most likely kind of spell to rear their heads in a social encounter. An undoubtedly useful ability, although it does rely on running into enemies who use charm effects, so it might not come up very often. Next is the 15th level ability called Purity of the Spirit. This gives a permanent protection from good and evil effect on the Paladin, which is a pretty good buff. Protection from good and evil is a powerful defensive spell that usually gets overlooked because it uses up concentration. Not the case here. This gives the Paladin strong defenses against aberrations, celestials, elementals, fae, fiends, and undead. It gives those creature types disadvantage to attack the Paladin and makes the Paladin immune to being charmed, frightened, or possessed. Effective, but a little redundant, as a lot of the utility of this effect is rendered moot by the charm immunity devotion Paladin already has. And at level 15, monsters are likely hitting very often with disadvantage imposed by protection. Not bad, but not outstanding either. And again, suffers from being a bit situational. The Oath's final feature is the 20th level capstone ability called Holy Nimbus. It is invoked by using an action and lasts for 1 minute. It makes the Paladin project a 30-foot aura of sunlight that constantly deals 10 radiant damage in the radius to any enemy who starts their turn in it. The radiant aura also projects light in the radius and dim light 30 feet beyond that. It also gives advantage on saves against spells by fiends or undead. The area of effect damage can be good when you get swarmed, but 10 damage isn't a lot for a 20th level character, especially when you have to commit your action to do so. A 20th level Paladin would be needing to catch dozens of enemies in the aura to compete in overall damage with just their melee attack. And the other effects aren't doing a whole lot either. An undoubtedly lackluster capstone. While often considered the default Paladin, Oath of Devotion has an issue where it doesn't make the Paladin that much better at being an anti-fiend and undead expert like the Paladin naturally is, and a lot of the abilities are either very situational or even overlap with each other. It doesn't even grant many good spells, just an underwhelming subclass compared to the other available options. And at 8th place in this ranking, we have Oath of the Ancients. The Oath of the Ancients Paladin, often known as Green Knight, is another original player's handbook option, and is meant to be associated with guarding nature and life from external threats. Some of this is on display with some of the new spells the Oath gains coming from the Druid spell list, like Moonbeam, Plant Growth, Commune with Nature, and, perhaps the most relevant, Misty Step. Access to Misty Step is one of the strongest spells any martial class can gain. 30 feet of teleportation that only uses a bonus action never goes out of style. And the rest of the Druid spells have their niche uses, though things like Moonbeam and Plant Growth are competing with the ever-valuable Attack with Smite option for Paladins to use their action on. This Oath's channel divinities are called Nature's Wrath and Turn the Faithless. Nature's Wrath works more like a control spell. targeting a creature the Paladin can see within 10 feet and making them make a dexterity or strength save of their choice to be restrained. Not that great. The super limited range is bad enough, but the fact the enemy gets to choose their better save really puts a damper on this ability. Turn the Faithless is another turn undead-inspired channel divinity, working on only Fae and Fiends instead of the more common undead. The only added caveat is it does dispel any shapeshifting or illusion on those affected. This can be particularly useful against invisible enemies, although still only on Fae and Fiends. These are pretty underwhelming channel divinities and are rarely worth wasting a whole action on, aside from the rare mob of enemies affected from the Turn the Faithless ability. Next is the level 7 ability, the Aura of Warding. It gives the Paladin allies within 10 feet resistance to damage from spells, or within 30 feet at 18th level. This is a really big feast or famine ability. The double whammy of a Paladin's saving throw increasing aura and the Ancient Paladin's resistance to spell damage can completely neuter spellcasting enemies in a way few other classes in the game can. Turning a fireball from an average 28 damage area of effect spell on your team to a 7 damage one is a big deal. But if you're not facing down spellcasters very often, you could easily find this to be pretty unimpressive. The 15th level ability is called Undying Sentinel, which basically works like the Half-Orc's Relentless Endurance ability. Once per long rest, when you would be reduced to 0 hit points without being killed outright, you can choose to drop to 1 hit point instead. This is an all-star racial ability for Half-Orcs, but largely because it comes at level 1. This ability still is pretty good at level 15, but you're much more likely to be taking down enemies with multiple attacks at higher levels, meaning they can just follow up with another attack and knock you unconscious. Still, certainly a solid ability that can be incredibly clutch even at higher levels. And hey, a Half-Orc Paladin can do it twice. Finally, the level 20 capstone ability is called Elder Champion. Using an action to assume the Elder Champion form, for 1 minute you gain 10 hit points worth of regeneration at the start of every turn. The ability to use a bonus action to cast a Paladin spell that would normally use an action, and gives enemies within 10 feet of you disadvantage against your channel divinity abilities. This transformation is insane. The regeneration turns you into a Terminator-style unstoppable tank who just keeps getting up every turn when you go unconscious, never losing your action unless your enemy commits to killing you. The channel divinity buff isn't that great, since the channel divinities are kind of niche in usage, but they become a lot better when enemies are rolling at disadvantage. But, most importantly, it breaks action economy in a preposterous way, allowing the Paladin to fling spells while still doing a full smite in powered attacks, or even letting the Paladin use a spell the turn they activate this ability is patently game-breaking. This is plainly one of the most impressive self-buffs in the game, if not the most impressive. Getting Quicken Spell metamagic on every spell for 10 straight turns is arguably the most powerful thing in this entire ranking. Even if Paladins don't have the strongest spell list, this ability is rife for abuse. Just being able to revivify a dead ally with a bonus action is great, even for 20 level characters. If all Paladins started off at level 20, Oath of the Ancients might be near the top of this list for this ability alone. Unfortunately, that's rarely the case, so it finds itself near the bottom. Elder Champion might be an absurd ability, but the rest of the oaths leave a lot to be desired. Access to Misty Step is doing a lot of heavy lifting, keeping it just above Oath of Devotion. Next in our ranking at 7th place, we have the Oath of the Watchers. The Oath of the Watchers is heavily geared towards fighting against extraplanar enemies. Its abilities specifically target aberrations, fae, fiends, celestials, and elementals. Their added spells known are a few very interesting non-paladin spells, including most notably Hold Monster and Counterspell, which are all-star spells in their own right. The counterspell inclusion is obviously geared towards stopping extraplanar monsters who often come with innate spellcasting, but the Paladin's limited spell progression means it'll never be able to upcast counterspell like a true caster, making it not quite as great as counterspell usually is. And, like any spell, Hold Monster is competing with the Paladin's all-too-valuable attack option. Still, good spells to have on hand no matter what. Next is its channel divinity abilities, Abjure the Extraplanar and Watcher's Will. Abjure the Extraplanar is another turn undead style ability, but against the extraplanar list of monster types mentioned earlier. Much like the Devotion and Ancient Paladins problems, your charisma is almost always secondary to your attacking ability, and a lot of these creatures don't like a smite to the face any more than they do being turned. Still, turning such a wide array of monster types is always going to have some utility, and this is strictly better than the Oath of the Ancients Turn the Faithless channel divinity. Branching out to so many non-undead enemies lets the Paladin branch out beyond their usual role in a significant way. Watcher's Will lets the Paladin use their action to give advantage on all intelligence, charisma, and wisdom saves to themselves and creatures of the choice equal to the Paladin's charisma modifier within 30 feet for 1 minute. If you're against specific enemies who are targeting those saves, then this ability can be a lifesaver, though costing an action is a heavy toll. Oftentimes, the best way to stop someone targeting you or your allies with dangerous saves is the Paladin walking up and doing a ton of damage. That said, it can really help allies who already succumb to a control style spell and are trying to break free. A pretty useful defensive option. Their 7th level ability, Aura of the Sentinel, is less niche than these other abilities. It gives a bonus to initiative equal to the Paladin's proficiency bonus to the Paladin and all allies within 10 feet, or 30 feet at 18th level. Initiative bonuses are few and far between in 5th edition because it's powerful to go first in combat. The start of a fight is often when the Paladin will find themselves close to all their allies, providing a bit of inherent synergy with its own effect. Just a great ability that'll be relevant in every single fight. Next is the 15th level Vigilant Rebuke ability, which states that when someone within 30 feet of the Paladin succeeds on an Intelligence, Charisma, or Wisdom saving throw, the Paladin can use their reaction to do 2d8 plus their Charisma modifier radiant damage to the creature who forced the save. This is extremely niche. While it does work well with the Watcher's Will ability, the damage is pretty minimal, and you can often find better uses for your reaction in the game. Synergy doesn't always mean quality, and this is a pretty good example of that. Doing 14 average radiant damage every now and then is certainly lackluster at level 15. It'd probably be wiser to save a reaction for an attack of opportunity or a counterspell. Lastly, we have the 20 level capstone ability, Mortal Bulwark. It's a bonus action and gives the Paladin 120 feet of true sight, advantage on attacks against aberrations, fae, fiends, celestials, and elementals, and adds a banish style effect every time the Paladin hits a creature. Upon hit, this forces a charisma save on the creature and it's banished to their native plane if they're not currently there, though they become immune to this effect for 24 hours if they make the save the first time. A pretty powerful effect, though notably less so if you're in an enemy's plane when you do this. And that's part of the problem. Every one of these abilities except the initiative bonus always comes with a condition, a restriction, or an odd downside. It takes a lot of the problems of the Devotion Paladin focusing solely on fiends and undead and just applies it to a different set of enemies. That said, the abilities are a bit better tuned, and considering Paladins are already strong against undead, gaining utility against other creature types is a solid bonus. The final ability being a bonus action, the Great Level 7 Aura, and the Turn Undead style Channel Divinity being a bit more widespread in usage, keeps the Oath of the Watcher off the bottom of the list. Next up in the ranking at 6th place, we have the Oath of the Glory Paladin. The Oath of the Glory is largely focused around empowering themselves as they wade into combat. The added spells are focused on self-buffing, with spells like Heroism, Enhance Ability, Freedom of Movement, and the ever-powerful Haste. The downside is that the Glory of the Paladin is adding a lot of spells that are already competing for concentration, and concentration is risky for a frontline combatant. That said, Haste is incredibly powerful, and can't be knocked as an added spell Paladins usually don't have access to. The channel divinities are Peerless Athlete and Inspiring Smite. Peerless Athlete lets the Paladin use a bonus action to gain advantage in athletics and acrobatics, while also doubling their carry, push, drag, and lift weights. It also increases jump distance by 10 feet. These effects are nifty, and there is some fun grapple and shove shenanigans that gain advantage in athletics can let you abuse while using this as a bonus action, but these stats are rarely game-changing, so buffing them is fairly low impact. Inspiring Smite is a bit more generally useful, as whenever you successfully use your Divine Smite, which should happen all the time as a Paladin, you can divide 2d8 plus the Paladin's level and temporary hit points to anyone within 30 feet. Temporary HP is always nice, and this requiring no kind of action means it's just a solid free buff that makes you and your allies significantly tougher. These are the positive divergences from the previous channel divinities because they don't ever compete for your action, being a bonus action and an automatic effect respectively. The 7th level feature is maybe the most awkward of any aura on this list, though still pretty powerful. It gives the Paladin and their allies who start their turn within 5 feet of the Paladin 10 feet of extra movement speed. This is great for the Paladin. 10 movement speed is a huge bonus and something a lot of melee characters happily expend a feat to get. And unlike a lot of auras on this list that buff allies, the movement speed often finds itself only affecting the Paladin, as they dash into combat and their allies start their turn not within 5 feet of them. With most other auras, allies can move on their turn into the range of the aura to gain their effect. While this one doesn't work that way unless the ally ends their turn next to the Paladin and the Paladin doesn't move on their next turn. Pretty restrictive for an ability designed to increase mobility. Next is the 15th level ability, Glorious Defense. This feature is pretty impressive. When the Paladin or a creature within 10 feet of them is hit, they can use their reaction to add their Charisma modifier to that target's armor class. And if the attacker misses because of this, the Paladin can attack them once as part of the same reaction. It has the potential to be an improved combination of the shield spell and the sentinel feat for anyone within 10 feet. Though, if your Paladin isn't swimming in ability modifiers and has a mediocre charisma, then this can be pretty lackluster. But if you do have a +5 to charisma, then it's a great use of reaction. The 20th level capstone ability is a bonus action called Living Legend. Like previous capstones, it's another self-buff effect that gives the Paladin advantage in all charisma checks, lets them decide to hit on an attack that misses once per turn, and allows them to use a reaction to reroll a saving throw. All pretty strong effects in their own right, even adding a bit of non-combat utility. Though by level 20, social situations are often a moot point. The other benefits are definitely worth a bonus action in combat. Guaranteed damage and saving throw security are good at any level. The biggest weakness of the Glory Paladin and why it finds itself barely in the bottom half of this list is the strongest abilities come late, and the early abilities can be a little underwhelming in impact or just plain awkward to use. Not a bad option, it's just running up against some very strong competition. Speaking of which, ranking at 5th on this list, we have the Oath of the Crown Paladin. The Oath of the Crown Paladin acts as a stalwart guard of civilization and laws. Their added spell list doesn't give any impactful options, but one important spell of note is Spirit Guardians. Paladins often lack for area of effect damage, and Spirit Guardians is one of the best area damage spells in the game, especially on a melee fighter who can bring the area right on top of enemies. The other new spells are Aura Vitality and Guardian of Faith. The former has some niche uses as a powerful healing spell, but the latter is a big waste of a higher level spell slot for a pretty uninspiring amount of damage. Next is the Channel Divinity abilities, which is where the Oath of the Crown really shines. The first is called Champion Challenge, and it lets the Paladin use a bonus action to target as many creatures within 30 feet of them as they wish, force a Wisdom saving throw, and any creature who fails can't move more than 30 feet away from the Paladin until the Paladin is incapacitated, or the creature ends up being more than 30 feet away from it. Not the most powerful control ability, but it is a bonus action. Any area of effect or multi-target movement restriction ability you can get that's also a bonus action really adds a lot of versatility to your combat options. The next one is Turn the Tide. This is another bonus action, lets the Paladin heal each creature within 30 feet of them for 1d6 plus the Charisma modifier, so long as those being healed are at least at half hit points or lower. Now, this is absurdly good. It's comparable to one of the best healing spells in the game, Mass Healing Word. While the half hit point restriction is a little awkward, it's still a ranged bonus action multi-target healing ability. Aptly named too, as bringing multiple allies up from unconscious can quickly turn a fight around. These two channel divinities really stand out as expanding the Paladin's combat role without stepping on their toes and competing for the Paladin's actions. The 7th level ability is called Divine Allegiance. This allows the Paladin to use their reaction to magically substitute their health for a target creature who takes the damage, so long as the creature is within 5 feet of them. This is a pretty solid defensive ability. Being able to keep a close to death ally from further damage is always nice, as is protecting the concentration of an allied caster. The 5 feet of range can hamstring this ability a bit though. Even 10 feet would make it more synergistic with the Paladin's inherent 10-foot saving throw increasing aura, but still a respectable defensive tool. At 15th level, the Oath of the Crown gains the Unyielding Spirit ability. It flatly gives the Paladin advantage on saves to avoid being paralyzed or stunned. Paralyze and stun are very rare conditions in the game, even at high levels, so this one isn't going to come up very much. I wouldn't be surprised if it never comes up in a campaign. Though, if it does, avoiding these two status effects can be life-saving as they're some of the worst to be afflicted by. Finally, the 20th level capstone ability is called Exalted Champion. Upon using it in action, for 1 hour, the Paladin gains resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons. Their allies within 30 feet of them gain advantage on death saves, and the Paladin allies within 30 feet gain advantage on wisdom saving throws. While it does take an action, the fact that it lasts for an hour gives it a leg up over some of the other capstones on this list that require an action, as you can easily use it preemptively. The effects are pretty solid. Damage resistance is great, though a lot of enemies' attacks counts as magical at high levels, so your mileage may vary. The death save bonus is nifty, but rarely game-changing. It pales compared to even the previously mentioned Turn the Tide ability for helping downed allies. The advantage on wisdom saves, though, is pretty powerful. The only downside might be that level 20 you could have access to something like Hero's Feast, which can make this a little redundant. All in all, still a pretty powerful bonus, and the duration does help it stand out. Oath of the Crown really peaks at early levels, when those Channel Divinity abilities first show up. They're real game changers, but the latter half of the subclass is fairly mediocre, giving it its middle spot in this ranking. Alright, and seeing as this full video was just a little bit too long, we split it into 2 parts.